T is the early hours of December 16th, 1944, and a jeep rattles along a frost-hardened road in the Ardennes forest. Four men sit inside, wrapped in olive drab overcoats, chewing gum, cursing the cold in flat American accents. To the sentries who wave them through checkpoints near Malmedy, they look exactly like what they claim to be: rear-echelon soldiers of the United States Army, perhaps engineers, perhaps military police, perhaps medics rushing forward with supplies. Nobody gives them a second glance. That is precisely the point. Beneath the borrowed uniforms, the captured dog tags, and the carefully rehearsed slang, these men are German soldiers, and within hours, their presence will trigger one of the strangest waves of paranoia to sweep through an army in the whole of the Second World War. This is the story of the men sent behind Allied lines dressed as Americans, sometimes even posing as medics and military police, in a mission so audacious that its psychological effects would outlast its military ones by decades. It matters not because of the bridges it seized or the shots it fired, but because of what it revealed: that a handful of men in the wrong uniform could unravel the trust an entire army depended on to function. To understand why Germany was willing to gamble on something as unconventional as soldiers dressed as enemy medics and military police, it helps to look back at what the war had already taught both sides about the value of confusion. Throughout 1944, the German army had watched its front collapse in both the East and the West with a speed that stunned even its most experienced commanders. Normandy had fallen. Paris had fallen. By September, Allied spearheads were probing the borders of Germany itself, and for a brief, hopeful moment on the Allied side, some believed the war might be over by Christmas. That optimism, as it turned out, was premature, and Hitler intended to make sure of it. By December 1944, Adolf Hitler had staked what remained of Germany's strategic reserves on a single throw of the dice. The plan, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, called for a massive armored thrust through the Ardennes, splitting the American and British armies and driving all the way to Antwerp before the Allies could react. Everything depended on speed. German commanders knew that their forces could not win a battle of attrition against the industrial might of the United States. They needed the kind of shock and confusion that had characterized the invasions of Poland and France years earlier, when panic and rumor had done as much damage as tanks and dive bombers. The difficulty was that by late 1944, the Wehrmacht no longer possessed the fuel, the aircraft, or the manpower to guarantee that kind of overwhelming force. What it still possessed was Otto Skorzeny, the commando who had rescued Mussolini from a mountaintop prison in 1943, and who had built a reputation, deserved or not, as the Reich's foremost specialist in the impossible. Hitler summoned Skorzeny in October 1944 and gave him an assignment that sounded, even to a man used to outlandish orders, faintly absurd. Assemble a brigade of soldiers who could pass as Americans, send them racing ahead of the main advance in captured jeeps and lorries, and use them to seize key bridges over the Meuse, spread false orders, redirect traffic, cut telephone wires, and generally turn the rear of the American lines into chaos. On paper, it demanded hundreds of soldiers fluent in American English, familiar with American slang, capable of impersonating everything from a bored quartermaster to an anxious military policeman waving traffic down the wrong road. In practice, the German army could barely find enough men who spoke English at all, let alone spoke it convincingly. The existing solution, ordinary infiltration by scouts in German uniform, offered no chance of getting men deep behind the lines undetected. Something far bolder was required, and there was almost no time to build it. The unit that emerged from this order was Panzer Brigade 150, assembled at the Grafenwöhr training grounds in Bavaria under conditions of extreme secrecy. Skorzeny's recruiters combed prisoner-of-war interrogation records, naval crews, and Wehrmacht personnel files searching for anyone with genuine exposure to American speech and culture, whether through years working in the United States before the war, service aboard merchant vessels, or simply an ear for accents. Fewer than 24 men were judged fluent enough to operate as commandos who might survive close questioning. The rest, several hundred more, were sorted into a second tier, capable of passing only in brief, superficial encounters, and a third tier who barely spoke English at all but could still wear the uniform and drive the vehicles. The training that followed was almost theatrical in its thoroughness. Recruits studied American cigarette brands, learned to chew gum with the right kind of insolence, practiced complaining about army food in the correct regional accents, and memorized the ranks, insignia, and slang of a military they had never served in. Uniforms and equipment were assembled from a patchwork of sources, gear stripped from prisoners of war, items purchased on the black market, and captured stores taken during the retreat from France. The unit's mechanics converted German vehicles to resemble American jeeps and armored cars as closely as possible, welding on new fenders, repainting insignia, even attaching the star markings that identified Allied transport, though shortages meant that some of the promised American jeeps and Sherman tanks never arrived in anything like the numbers Scorsese had wanted. Ammunition, weapons, and radios all had to match what an American unit would realistically carry, since a German-issue Luger discovered in the pocket of an American uniform was as good as a signed confession. Scorsese divided his infiltrators into small teams, generally 4 men to a jeep, each given specific tasks ranging from reconnaissance and sabotage to something far simpler and, in the end, far more effective, spreading confusion. A team that identified itself as military police, directing convoys down the wrong roads, or reporting false troop movements, required no fighting at all to disrupt an advance. A handful of men claiming to be army medics, waving through checkpoints on the pretext of rushing wounded to the rear, could move almost anywhere without challenge. The entire scheme rested less on combat power than on the simple fact that soldiers under pressure, in the dark, in unfamiliar terrain, tend to trust a uniform before they question a face. The logistics behind maintaining that illusion were considerably more fragile than the concept itself suggested. Every detail mattered, and every detail was also inevitably imperfect. American cigarettes tasted different from German ones, and the wrong brand in a top pocket could raise a question a nervous sentry might not otherwise think to ask. American vehicles idled at a different pitch, roughly comparable to the difference between a modern car engine and an older diesel, a difference that a mechanically minded soldier might notice even in the dark. Radio procedure differed subtly between the two armies, in the phrasing used to report positions, the cadence of a routine check-in, the small verbal habits that become second nature after months of service and nearly impossible to fake convincingly on short notice. Scorsese's men had weeks, not years, to absorb all of this, and the training at Grafenwöhr, however intensive, could never fully close that gap. What it could do, and did do with real success, was equip the infiltrators with just enough fluency and just enough confidence to survive the brief, high-pressure interactions that made up most of a checkpoint encounter, an exchange lasting perhaps 30 seconds in which hesitation mattered more than accent. When the offensive began before dawn on December 16th, only a fraction of the planned brigade, somewhere in the region of a few dozen jeep teams, rather than the hundreds originally envisioned, actually slipped through the German lines and into American-held territory. Even that small number achieved an outsized effect. Teams cut telephone wires near Malmedy, turned road signs to send American convoys in circles, and in at least one documented case redirected an entire regiment away from a critical crossroads for hours. Some posed as military police redirecting traffic at junctions, calmly waving lorries and jeeps down roads that led nowhere useful, while others impersonated engineers or medical personnel to move freely near forward positions. The psychological impact outstripped anything the small numbers involved could account for. Word spread through American ranks that German commandos in American uniform were operating behind the lines, and within days, that rumor metastasized into something close to hysteria. Soldiers began interrogating one another at checkpoints with questions no German could plausibly answer, the identity of Mickey Mouse's girlfriend, the capital of a particular American state, the name of a baseball team's home stadium. General Omar Bradley himself was reportedly stopped and quizzed about the geography of Illinois. Most damaging to German fortunes was a rumor, never substantiated and almost certainly false, that Skorzeny's men had been tasked with assassinating General Eisenhower in Paris. The story spread so widely that Eisenhower was effectively confined to his headquarters under heavy guard for several days, an outcome that, whatever its accuracy, achieved precisely the kind of disruption Skorzeny had hoped for, only aimed at the very top of the Allied command rather than at a bridge or a road junction. The consequences for captured infiltrators were severe and immediate. Under the laws of war, as understood at the time, a soldier who fought in the uniform of the enemy forfeited the protections normally granted to a prisoner of war and could be treated as a spy, which typically meant execution. American military police captured several small teams of Skorzeny's men in the days following the offensive's opening, and at least 16 were tried by military tribunal and shot near the town of Henri-Chapelle in Belgium in the days that followed, their German uniforms worn underneath American ones as a technical and ultimately unpersuasive defense against the charge of espionage. Skorzeny himself, along with several subordinates, was later tried at Dachau by an American military tribunal on related charges, though the court accepted a defense that the men had not actually fired weapons while disguised, and Skorzeny was acquitted, a verdict that surprised many observers given the notoriety of the operation. The comparison with other wartime deception efforts throws the German scheme into sharper relief. The Allies had, in fact, been running their own elaborate deceptions for years by this point, most famously Operation Fortitude, the fictitious army group commanded on paper by General Patton that convinced German intelligence the main invasion of Europe would fall at Calais rather than Normandy. Fortitude worked through inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and double agents feeding false information, an entirely bloodless form of deception built on patience and misdirection over many months. Skorzeny's operation, by contrast, was compressed into days, relied on a handful of men taking enormous personal risks rather than an entire fictional order of battle, and traded strategic misdirection for tactical chaos. Germany had also experimented earlier in the war with infiltrators in Allied uniform during the invasions of the Low Countries in 1940, though never at this scale or with this degree of linguistic preparation. The Americans, for their part, had no directly equivalent program in the European theater, largely because Allied commanders considered such operations to sit uncomfortably close to the line the laws of war drew around legitimate combat, a line German planners were fully aware they were crossing and chose to cross regardless, judging the potential disruption worth the legal and moral risk. The result was a scheme that, measured purely in territory taken or bridges seized, achieved almost nothing, since few of the planned objectives near the Meuse were ever reached by Skorzeny's infiltrators. Measured in terms of panic generated per soldier committed, it was strikingly, disproportionately effective. There is also the question of scale, which the Allies got badly wrong in the days after the offensive began, and which is worth dwelling on because it explains so much of what followed. Skorzeny had originally hoped to field something in the region of 2,000 men across the full brigade, organized into dozens of jeep teams supported by a handful of captured or disguised tanks. Fuel shortages, vehicle breakdowns, and the sheer difficulty of finding genuinely convincing English speakers meant that the force which actually crossed into American lines was a small fraction of that number. By most post-war estimates, somewhere between 8 and 30 jeep teams rather than the hundreds originally planned. American intelligence, working from captured documents, interrogated prisoners, and the sheer volume of rumor flooding every headquarters in the Ardennes, had no reliable way of knowing this at the time. Reports arrived suggesting infiltrators numbering in the hundreds, then the thousands, each report more alarming and less accurate than the last. Military police units, already stretched thin trying to manage the chaos of a retreating front, found themselves fielding an entirely new category of suspect: the ordinary American soldier who could not adequately prove he was who his uniform claimed him to be. This mismatch between the tiny actual scale of Operation Greif and the enormous imagined scale that spread through rumor is in many ways the central irony of the whole episode, and it is a pattern that recurs again and again in the history of deception operations, where the story an army tells itself about the threat often does more damage than the threat itself ever could. The historical verdict on Operation Greif, as the mission was formally known, remains a study in the gap between material and psychological effect. Only a small number of American vehicles were actually diverted for any meaningful length of time, and no strategic objective, such as a Meuse crossing, was ever captured or even seriously threatened by the Jeep teams. And yet the ripple effects reached every American checkpoint in the Ardennes for the remainder of the battle, slowing the movement of Allied units, wasting the time of military police, and forcing an already stretched command structure to divert attention toward hunting for infiltrators who, in most sectors, were simply not there. Some historians argue this was Skorzeny's true achievement, that an operation which failed by almost every conventional military measure succeeded brilliantly as an exercise in pure disruption, sowing doubt in a way that outlasted the handful of days its participants spent behind enemy lines. Others point out that the paranoia it triggered may have cost the Americans more in wasted effort chasing phantom infiltrators than the real infiltrators themselves ever managed to inflict, an irony that would not have displeased Skorzeny. The episode left a lasting mark on how military planners think about deception and unconventional warfare, feeding directly into later doctrine on psychological operations and influencing the strict rules that modern armies apply to the wearing of enemy uniforms in combat, a practice explicitly prohibited under the Geneva Conventions in their post-war revisions. A handful of the jeeps and uniforms associated with the operation survive today in military museums in Belgium and the United States, quiet artifacts of an episode that briefly made an entire army question the man standing next to it. It is worth pausing on just how quickly the story of Operation Greif passed from military record into folklore, because the two are not always easy to separate. Within weeks of the battle's end, exaggerated accounts were already circulating in newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic, some describing hundreds of German commandos roaming freely behind American lines for months, rather than the handful of days the real operation actually lasted. Skorzeny himself, ever conscious of his own reputation, did little to correct these exaggerations after the war, and in interviews and memoirs he allowed the scale of the mission to inflate rather than deflate, a choice that served his image as Europe's most dangerous commando rather better than the more modest truth would have. Post-war historians sifting through American and German records have had to work carefully to separate what could be documented, capture reports, tribunal transcripts, unit war diaries, from what was simply rumor repeated so often it hardened into accepted fact. This gap between record and legend is itself part of the story, a reminder that deception operations, once they succeed in generating fear, tend to keep generating it long after the last participant has been captured, tried, or sent home. Return for a moment to that jeep on the frost-hardened road outside Malmedy, the four men inside chewing gum and cursing the cold in accents rehearsed for months at Grafenwöhr. They were not supermen, and they did not win the Battle of the Bulge, nor were they ever remotely close to doing so. What they achieved was smaller and stranger. For a handful of days in December 1944, they made an entire army afraid of its own uniform. Soldiers who had crossed an ocean to fight a war found themselves interrogating fellow Americans about baseball statistics at gunpoint. A five-star general found himself confined to his own headquarters by a rumor that may never have been true. 16 young men were shot by firing squad for the crime of wearing the wrong coat. None of this changed the outcome of the war. All of it changed, for a few critical days, how the war was fought on the ground in the Ardennes, one suspicious glance and one nervous checkpoint at a time. That is the strange legacy of Operation Greif, Not the bridges it took because it took none of consequence, and not the battles it won because it won none at all, but the simple, unsettling fact that trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to fully repair, and that an army which cannot trust the uniform in front of it has already lost something no tank or artillery barrage can measure. The Jeep rattles on into the dark, and somewhere ahead of it, an entire army is starting to wonder who else might not be who they claim to be.